Good evening, everyone. And hello, I'm Kurt Gehring, Executive Director here at the Center for Victims of Torture. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for this important, this timely conversation about the experiences of LGBTQ torture survivors. Among the survivors CVT works with across the globe are individuals who are tortured for no other reason than who they love, how they identify, simply because of who they are. I want to start by putting a face to this work and to tell you about Peter, a survivor we worked with in Nairobi, Kenya. Peter is one of those people who just draws you in with his warmth and his friendliness. But behind his smile, his infectious smile, are physical reminders of the horrors he's endured, scars that will never go away. Peter came to CVT after fleeing Uganda, where he'd been living with his partner. But he'd been living in secret. When his family learned he was gay, they rejected him. The neighbors attacked him, calling him an abomination. But that's not the worst of it. After his neighbors beat him and left him for dead, the police arrested Peter instead of taking him to a hospital. Peter eventually escaped to Nairobi. He was overwhelmed by his thoughts, the aftermath of his beatings. He felt worthless. He felt like no one cared whether he existed or not. And that's when he found CVT's LGBTQ group counseling program. And for the first time in his life, Peter knew he was not alone. At CVT, he connected with others within the LGBTQ community who had all endured torture simply for being who they are. After weeks in the counseling program, Peter discovered his own self-worth. He learned coping skills to manage the impact of the trauma he had experienced. And even though Kenya was safer than Uganda, it was and still is very dangerous for Peter and other LGBTQ people. Hope for a bright future continued to slip through the cracks. When his employer found out he was gay, Peter was fired. He was forced to move his residence time after time because once his neighbors learned of his identity, they became hostile. At one point, he was even arrested and tortured again, this time by police in Kenya. Despite all the instability and the danger forced upon Peter, his resilience carried him through, and he came back week after week to CVT for group therapy. And when we launched a new Aftercare program in 2017, which you'll hear more about in just a bit, Peter was one of the first peer facilitators. Today, Peter still fears the police, but he's not letting his fear paralyze him. He's able to cope. He's able to function. He takes walks in his neighborhood. He does breathing exercises when he feels overwhelmed. Peter says CVT made him feel like a person again. This is what we do at CVT with support from people like you. We help torture survivors get their lives back here in the United States, in the Middle East, and in East Africa. And while we care for all survivors of torture, we know LGBTQ survivors have unique experiences of torture and persecution, and therefore have unique needs for healing care as well. And I am so grateful you here with us today care about this important work of healing. Thank you. And now I am delighted to introduce to you a colleague and friend, Victor Madrigal Borlos. Victor is the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And yes, that really is his title. Until June 2019, he served as the Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, of which CVT is a member. And this evening, we are incredibly grateful to have Victor join us. And we'll start by sharing a brief video about the mandate of his office.
In 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council created the mandate of the Independent Expert for Protection Against Violence and Discrimination based on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, the IESOGI. Since then, a lot of important and groundbreaking work has been done. The goals of the Independent Expert's mandate are to research, examine, and provide visibility to the violence and discrimination experienced every day by gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, and other gender-diverse persons around the world. With these findings, the IESOGI advises member states on best practices and measures needed to prevent, prosecute, and punish violence and discrimination through law, access to justice, and public policy. To achieve this, the Independent Expert's mandate uses 4 methods: visiting countries to conduct fact-finding missions and raise awareness, receiving allegations and concerns of violence and discrimination based on SOGI and bringing them to the attention of states, engaging constantly in dialogue with society, experts, academia, and states, and finally, conducting and publishing research on topics relevant to the mandate. So what can you expect to see more of? The mandate will continue dealing with individual cases, country visits and research, and speaking to the widest possible range of stakeholders. Every statement, report, and case finding is made public so that citizens and policymakers have the opportunity to reference the material during conversations with their national governments. While international support for the IESOGI mandate has grown since its creation, with much credit due to the active participation of civil society and great cooperation of member states, there is still much work and research to be done in order to ensure that every person, no matter where they live, who they are, or who they love, can live in a world free from violence and discrimination.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor to be here. I am grateful for the generous introduction by Kurt. It's wonderful, his wonderful words, and very grateful to be here in an event organized by CVT, an organization for which I have so much respect, learned and acquired during the many years in which I was working in the field of torture rehabilitation. It is important to acknowledge the role of leadership of civil society, not only in providing rehabilitation for torture victims, but also in ensuring the vital role of connecting the experience of survivors with advocacy, because that is the essential point through which the lived experience of victims is going to be linked effectively to public policy and to real change. And I'm very, very grateful to be invited to this event tonight to talk to you a little bit about my experience from the experience of Independent Expert. I also wanted to express my appreciation. It is for me an honor to share this space with Peter. I am a firm believer that all of the work that we all carry out needs to take point of departure in careful listening to the lived experience of victims and survivors, and that we also need to have the ensuring that the lives of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons around the world is improved through the work that we are able to carry out. So I'm very thankful to Peter for allowing me to share this space with him. Unfortunately, I do have to share with you that it's often the case that I'm sharing spaces with victims of torture on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It is very common, and violence and discrimination around the world are unfortunately a pervasive phenomenon. Yesterday, I was with Maxime Lapinov, the victim that has spoken against the so-called gay purge in Chechnya. and at the base of documentary Welcome to Chechnya, that is actually representing the enormous work of extracting victims from that Russian Republic into safety, 160 of them. A week ago, I was paying tribute to Loana Berkins, the Argentinian trans woman who maintained the fight for the rights of trans persons at the center of her work and lost her life as a result. Every day, I am confronted with the lived realities of persons that are actually at this point of intersection between sexual orientation, gender identity, torture, and particular experiences of violence. Now, one of the things that it's important to understand when I convey my experience to you is that nobody is defined by only one identity. My mandate works from the point of view of intersectionality. A wonderful activist from sub-Saharan Africa said to me recently, we all embody many identities in one body, and not one single one of them creates a unique experience of privilege or discrimination. It is the reuniting all of those identities that actually creates that unique lived experience that in some cases is so full of violence and discrimination. But of course, identities represent a point of entry, a way to understand what are the factors that have enabled, in many cases, the violence that is perpetrated against a particular individual. And therefore, this is the reason why there was great importance in the creation of the mandate of the independent expert, which I have the honor to occupy right now, because it represents the acceptance by the international community that sexual orientation and gender identity are necessary points of entry into studying the experience of exclusion, torture, and violence that many people are subjected to around the world. It was not an easy mandate to create. If any of you was following the process of creation in 2016, you would have known that it was unprecedented in the fact that it took 5 votes across the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations to finally create the mandate. But a strong coalition of civil society organizations, over 1,300 organizations coming from 174 countries, and a strong coalition of like-minded states made it possible. As you heard in the introductory video, I am supposed to be examining root causes of violence and discrimination. And in this work, I actually have now developed the theory that at the base of most, if not all, the violence and discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and otherwise gender diverse persons lies the idea that there is a norm that is desirable in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, what is interesting about this is that every person in this planet has a sexual orientation and gender identity. These are fundamentally human traits to have. Every human in the planet has a particular experience of sexual desire, and every human in this planet relates to gender expression and gender identity in a particular way. So what is it? Why is it that in certain contexts and in certain times, people who fall outside of what is considered to be the quote-unquote desirable norm in relation to that sexual orientation and gender identity, all of them fundamentally human, are subject to persecution? Well, I believe that there is a significant weight to be given to the defense of the way in which power is structured in society. Structures of power that in many cases will be relying on patriarchal structures and reliance on particular ways, roles that are assigned to women and men when they are born, that have expectation for women and men when they are born, and that basically determine the fate of people when they are born and as they are born. People who fall outside that norm, that defense of that system, are repressed through three main types of mechanisms. The first one is criminalization. As of today, a staggering 2 billion people live in contexts of criminalization, that is, in contexts in which homosexuality, lesbianism, or certain gender identities are criminalized. In 9 of them, the penalty is death. In 6 of them, it is applied as a matter of routine. In other contexts, the penalty can be as long as 25 years in jail. Even in countries, in contexts that are not criminalized, social sanctions are significant. And that is because the notion of criminalization has carved deep grooves in social awareness. Also because of the second mechanism, which is pathologization. As many of you will know, up until 30 years ago, homosexuality was considered to be a mental illness. And only until last year, trans persons needed to receive a diagnostic of gender dysphoria, also considered a mental illness, which was just eliminated from the list of diseases by the World Health Organization in May of last year. These forms of pathologization, this understanding that LGBT lives are somehow disordered in and of themselves, has created, again, carved these deep grooves in the medical profession, in the health profession, and in social conceptions and mores. As of today, 72% of health practitioners in Lebanon consider that homosexuality is a disease that must be cured. And therefore, it should not surprise any of us that practices as abhorrent as conversion therapy are pervasive all around the world. Because, of course, what is a diagnostic and what is an illness needs to be cured. We all know, of course, now that there's no illness to cure, but this is a conception that is going to take a very long to change. Finally, the third mechanism I called demonization, or the idea that people, that LGBT lives are sinful in some way or another. These three mechanisms refer to crime, illness, and sin. I call that the Unholy Trinity, in a reference to my cultural heritage as a Catholic. But the reality is that these mechanisms operate strongly and they create significant trends towards violence against LGBT persons. They all create the notion that LGBT persons are somehow not good citizens, not able to contribute to the fabric of society, and that they are others, to be cured, to be changed, to be repressed, or to be eliminated. The president of Chechnya expressed this opinion in an interview with a Canadian journalist. He said, "Gay people are not good Chechens," and I've heard it many times in all of my travels around the world. The accusation that LGBT persons are not good citizens is actually quite uniform in these mechanisms. We have heard of the experience of Peter, and this is what it represents in the everyday life of LGBT persons to actually have these mechanisms present. It's interesting, of course, that in situations such as COVID-19, all of these mechanisms that create that notion of otherness of LGBT persons are exacerbated. My colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Right to Food, calls COVID inequality in steroids. And early on in the pandemic, I dedicated myself and the resources of the mandate to listen to LGBT persons around the world as to how the pandemic was affecting them. And I've reached the conclusion that the problematic is actually manifesting itself in three particular streams. There are certain governments, firstly, that are using the pandemic as an excuse to pass measures of persecution or to carry out measures of persecution against LGBT persons. Many of us will have heard about a raid in Uganda, for example, carried out supposedly under the aegis of health regulations, but when interrogated, it happened that it was the only raid carried out against a homeless shelter during the whole pandemic so far, and that it was carried out against an LGBT shelter. The occupants of that shelter were placed in a COVID-infested prison for 2.5 months without access to lawyer, without access to their families, simply because of the fact that it had been announced that that was a homeless shelter dedicated to LGBT persons. The state of Hungary passed legislation withdrawing the possibility of legal recognition for trans persons under the aegis of health measures for the pandemic. This makes no sense. I'm on the public record as having interpolated the government of Hungary in this connection, because we know that in situations of emergency is when it is most fundamental for trans persons to actually have recognition and access to documents that match their appearance. Otherwise, they will be completely excluded from processes as concrete and as vital as to distribution of food and hygienic supplies. So that's the first type of consequences under COVID-19. The second is the impact of indirect discrimination. There are states that have adopted measures, either not including LGBT populations or not duly taking consultation processes. For example, in Latin America, there were a number of gender-based quarantines which were enacted in the idea that if you cut the population in two and you let men leave their homes on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and women leave their homes on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, it was going to be possible to make the numbers less on the public space during those days. Well, gender-based quarantines just revealed how completely unevenly distributed work is in the home. The days that women were out, the supermarkets were full of women carrying out the grocery shopping. The days that men were supposed to be out, it was mostly social spaces that were actually being filled. So you can see there how measures need to be having a measure of consultation with all concerned populations to have impact. But secondly, they meant that trans people who have not received legal recognition could never get out of their house, because on the day that their appearance matched the permission, their documents didn't, and on the days that their documents matched the permission, their appearance didn't. So this is an example of indirect discrimination that my mandate was very concerned with. Also, for example, assigning religious leaders that are known in some cases to be factors of discrimination themselves to distributing food, for example, was also at the origin of many denunciations of indirect discrimination. And then the third element and impact of COVID-19, which have concerned my mandate very much, is simply the fact that LGBT people, as a rule, did not arrive to the battleground of the pandemic on a level field. LGBT people, because of structures of discrimination and exclusion, are consistently overrepresented in the ranks of the poor, the ranks of those relying in informal employment, the ranks of homeless, and persons having consistent lower outcomes when it comes to health, for example. All of those factors mean that they come in a situation of great vulnerability to the pandemic, along with other vulnerable populations. The work that we are carrying out is ensuring that some visibility is provided to this factor from the lens of sexual orientation and gender identity, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, because we understand very strongly that it can be a prism through which to understand the experience of violence that so many persons experience around the world. I am wrapping up my presentation by expressing my hope that entities such as CVT, and certainly CVT, will be vigorously supported and will continue to be vigorously supported. The role that they play is fundamental in ensuring not only direct services to victims, but also, as I said at the beginning, in connecting those with the advocacy levels that, for example, provide information to my mandate. All of this that I have told you, I only know it because civil society is my correspondent and provides me with this information. And then, of course, the victims and the survivors, without whom and without whose dedication and courage, none of the work that we carry out at the level of human rights advocacy would be possible. I'm very hopeful that in the conversation today, we will be able to provide many of us, and I'm hoping to learn myself, with further elements of understanding as to why this work is vital and how we can best contribute to it. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here and eager to hear the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Victor, for sharing the incredible work you're doing and for helping us understand more deeply the experiences of LGBTQ torture survivors. It does remind me how very important our work is.
Thank you.
I am Paul Orien, a Senior Clinical Advisor for Mental Health at CVT. From our headquarters here in Minneapolis, I help oversee the Aftercare Program for LGBTQ survivors of torture in Nairobi, Kenya, where Peter, one of our survivors that we've talked about, found hope and healing with the generous support of people like you. Most of the survivors who come to CVT endured torture, fled from it, and then can be physically safe once they find refuge in another place. But LGBTQ survivors often never feel safe. The care we provide Peter and other LGBTQ survivors of torture make healing possible amid this ongoing persecution. Two of my colleagues, Karen and Jepkemoi, who work for CVT in Kenya, and who we recorded earlier because of the time difference in Nairobi and here, they are going to share with you about our programming over there in Nairobi. Thank you.
I'm Karen Taiwa, social worker for CVT Nairobi.
And I'm Jepkemoi Kibet, physiotherapist and trainer for CVT Nairobi. So for so many years, we've had a specific counseling and physiotherapy group sessions for LGBTQ survivors like Peter. We started these when Uganda was attempting to pass really terrible anti-LGBTQ laws. People were fleeing Uganda and seeking asylum in Kenya. So many LGBTQ individuals fleeing persecution and torture came to Kenya from different surrounding countries. So while Kenya is still very conservative, it is not as restrictive as the surrounding countries. It has been a place of relative safety for LGBT individuals in the region, but there aren't a lot of organizations that provide care to LGBTQ people, and there's still so much stigma. So after we started this multidisciplinary program, we became a safe haven in the community. And we started hearing feedback from survivors that needed more care to support their ongoing needs. Isolated and unable to be open with their identity, clients wanted a place where they could enhance their coping skills for the ongoing traumas they experience, as well as a place to continue having social connections with others like them. So what we did is that we developed what we call an aftercare program. It is a 6-week therapeutic program for clients who've already done our initial group therapy. In the aftercare program, we go deeper into developing resilience and social connection. We talk about healing from shame and victim blaming. And we talk about reconstructing identity and meaning. After completing the therapy session, one survivor told us, and I quote, "I blame myself for everything. and I lost hope and engaged in other activities that put my life at risk. I have hope now to live a meaningful life. I thought I was the only one in this situation, but after listening to others, I got to realize we all go through the same things.
We also spend a whole session on social services so that our clients know where they can receive care, where they won't be harassed or persecuted for doing so. Handouts with agency contacts are shared at the end of each session for reference. Peer facilitators conduct regular home visits with the survivors of torture to assess their needs and link them to partner organizations to help with rent, medical needs, livelihoods, food, and education. Sometimes LGBTQ survivors refuse the home visits because the people they're living with, for instance, their families, may not know about their gender identity or sexual orientation. We never push for it. And we do all we can to support the survivors where they are physically at CVT. That is why we have a physiotherapist, a social worker, and a psychotherapist in every group session.
So one of the most important things about our aftercare program is confidentiality. It is incredibly important for the safety of our clients and that they are not outed by our program. We also talk a lot about personal security, and our clients want to and have a right to express themselves. But the community is not very welcoming. We say that the community cannot guarantee you security if you cannot guarantee yourself security. And I'll give an example. Clients can't dress in a way that might suggest their gender identity or sexual orientation. The guys in the community will target you and they will definitely attack you. So we've had clients tell us, and I quote, "Now I've realized that if I need to really stay safe or keep my job or stay in my home so that the landlord will not send me away because they get to know who I am, I need to keep a low profile." We tell our clients that there are safe spaces where you can express yourself. But being in a community that is very homophobic, they need to be very careful.
And this is part of the reason why we have peer facilitators running the sessions. It is much better for this message to come from peers in the group who have had the same struggles. We hire and train peer facilitators from the LGBTQ refugee community in Nairobi, and currently there are 4. Newly recruited peer facilitators undergo trainings on aftercare manual, the basics of physiotherapy, psychotherapy, and social work. Peer facilitators help motivate the survivors in the group to keep practicing their coping skills and to connect them to services and support they need. They help spread the word about services we offer. When you've experienced torture and when you're hated for your identity, you can be overwhelmed with shame and a loss of dignity. You can feel completely alone. But peer facilitators are a powerful example that survivors are not alone. They are worthy and they can have a rich and fulfilling life, even amidst persecution. One peer facilitator told us, and I quote, "Being a client at CVT was really a turning point in my life. Besides transforming a fearful, lonely, miserable, and hopeless life that I once lived, it has boosted my self-esteem, and I became more social, creative, and resilient. I now work as a peer facilitator at CVT, which has enabled me to help my fellow LGBTQ community who are going through the same situation I went through. For me, I've seen really powerful transformations for LGBTQ survivors of torture. Thank you for your willingness to learn about this unique area of CVT's work and for making these transformations possible."
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I've been part of CVT's mission for more than 10 years now. And about 5 years ago, I got offered the opportunity to go to Amman, Jordan, to learn a little bit about the torture program that was in place there. A few members of CVT staff and board went, as well as some other supporters. We spent several days there and broke up into small groups. And I was honored to meet with 10 Iraqi men who had been tortured and gone through the 10-week program and hear what CVT had done for them and how it had helped their lives. So it was a profound experience for me. And less than 2 years later, I was offered the opportunity to go to Nairobi, Kenya, to learn about the program there. And it was somewhat unique in that they were beginning to see groups of torture survivors who identified as LGBTQ, most of them coming from Uganda, as you've heard earlier, but not all of them. Kurt Gehring and I went, and we spent 3 days. We met with 3 individuals, LGBTQ torture survivors, who'd been through the program. We met with them individually with their counselors. We met other staff members. And much like Aman Jordan, what I heard was gratitude for the program and a sense of relief and definitely a sense of hope, which was great. But I heard something different in Nairobi, and it was a sense of isolation, of not having community, of not having full access to resources, of not knowing where to turn. So while they'd been given renewed dignity and hope, they weren't certain what was going to come next. I found it really troubling, and I couldn't stop thinking about the individuals. And I was fortunate enough to meet Peter there, and we've talked a lot about Peter tonight, and he's an outstanding individual, very well spoken. And for every Peter, I assumed that there were dozens of individuals who couldn't speak as freely or speak as well, and we needed to do something for them. So back in the States, CVT and I had some discussions about what we could do. How could we help the LGBTQ in Nairobi? And out of that came the Aftercare Program that you heard Karen and Jeff talk about. We started that in 2017, and I pledged 3-year financial support. That is coming to an end this year in 2020, but the need hasn't disappeared, unfortunately. It's still there. And so I've extended my financial commitment to CVT's Aftercare Program for LGBTQ in Nairobi, and I'm going to ask you tonight to consider joining as well. It's about $32,000 a year for the Aftercare Program to allow individuals like Peter some continued hope and dignity and a new sense of self-worth. I hope you'll donate. We'll give you some information on how to do that. I'm very saddened by the hatred in our world, but deeply moved by the power of this program to make healing possible. Please join me in supporting CVT in this very specialized and important work. Now we're going to pass over to Laura, I think, who is going to take some questions for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen, for the impact that your generosity is having on Peter's life and on so many others' lives. And I'm going to invite all of our speakers to turn their videos on. And we've gotten so many questions. So to all of the attendees, thank you for these great questions. We are going to try to get through as many as we possibly can. So Paul, I'm going to send the first question to you. And we have a question from Thomas, who would like to know how many survivors participate in the Aftercare Program each year.
So given the resources that even Steve has mentioned, it's not a lot. So we do restrict numbers, but we see up to 60, maybe at least 60 survivors. It's not enough. We try to extend that, but usually around 60 survivors a year.
Great, thanks, Paul. Victor, question for you. Jim had a question, and he was hoping that you could elaborate a bit more on the second mechanism of oppression that you were speaking to. I believe it was pathologizing LGBTQ people.
Well, it's been a long process of insertion of homosexuality, lesbianism, and what was known as transgenderism at the time into the international classification of diseases as mental illnesses. And again, I think that this was very much a result of the work carried out with the surgeons of psychiatry and psychology as sciences. We can trace, of course, pathologization to late 19th century, early 20th century, and the formalization of it to the creation of classification of diseases throughout the century. The work of depathologization, as I mentioned, can be traced in different stages, but the great markers are 30 years ago, where homosexuality was withdrawn from the International Classification of Diseases, to last year, where gender dysphoria was taken out. But let me give you some very concrete examples of the way that this is working. I mentioned the case of Lebanon, which for me is very telling of the way that this works and the way that it has carved these grooves, as I mentioned. An informal survey was carried out in China with over 1,000 health providers. And out of those, an overwhelming majority for what the subject was, it was, I believe, 63% responded that they thought homosexuality was a disease that required to be cured. I have been in country visits to a number of countries where I have met with health practitioners who have explained to me how they consider that the classification and the diagnostics that they learned when they were in medical school are things that they need to continue to apply. And frankly, I've reacted in horror when sometimes I have heard medical practitioners said, well, I finally convinced this person that she was sick. And the horrible thing about it is it actually is a lot more frequent than what you would imagine. So this idea that a diagnostic would come and then therapy is required, because of course, as you know, therapy is the idea of curing something that is a pathology, and it's at the base of these horrible forms of conversion therapy. I just issued a report of conversion therapy in which I concluded that all forms of conversion therapy are degrading, cruel, and inhuman in nature. And to me, it's very worrisome when I know that hundreds and thousands of people are subjected to them every year. And they can go from practices that may seem to be quite benign, such as psychological approaches or medical approaches, to horrifying acts of rape and electrocution and beatings and torture. But in all cases, they're discrimination and derogatory. So to me, those are part of the tentacles of that phenomenon of pathologization.
Thank you, Victor, for sharing that. Kurt, we have a question for you. Rebecca would like to know if you have any idea how many torture survivors identify as LGBTQ worldwide. And then a follow-up question is, do you know how many CBT clients identify as LGBTQ?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I guess the short answer is we don't really know how many survivors come to us are LGBTI survivors. And there's a number of reasons for this. And as was mentioned previously, in so many of the countries where we work, the homosexuality is a criminal offense. And so we don't ask, our clinicians don't ask that question. And often survivors don't volunteer that, although sometimes they do. It's also risky to keep records on this kind of information, especially because it is a punishable offense in many countries. And there's the risk sometimes that the records might be hacked. So clients from Uganda, for example, are maybe a particular risk. We do know the numbers that we work with domestically as well as our programs internationally when they identify themselves as LGBTI survivors, and it's a relatively small percentage. I would say of the thousands that we work with globally, it's at our programs internationally, it's around 2%, and domestically, I would say it's around 4%. But this has to be regarded as an absolute minimum, and it is really a fraction of the total, because that information is too risky to be disclosed.
Thanks, Kurt, for kind of navigating that complexity with us. Victor, we have another question for you, and this question comes from Shamila, and she would like to know what work is being done to educate and create awareness in communities that do not accept LGBTQ people and label them as poor citizens or non-religious, specifically emphasizing that being LGBTQ is not a disease. So kind of in the overview of your work, how are you interacting with communities that think that being LGBTQ is still a disease?
The very foundation of my mandate is that visibility, increased visibility, will create an awareness of the fact that LGBT persons are like everyone else. Of course, I will not use the word normal because that is a given, but like everyone else, meaning with the ability of being good citizens, with the possibility that have a few that are not, with the possibility that some are very nice, some may not be, like everyone else, period. Now, what are the challenges in this connection is that my mandate is very committed to providing visibility, and I gave you a figure of the number of organizations that interact with my mandate. It's over 1,300 around the world, but there are many more, so there's great movements towards these strides. And as you know, here in the United States, for example, increased visibility by people coming out of the closet, by politicians actually living free and equal with their families as they are, and so on and so forth, is a big part of just instilling this notion that that there's this ability to see people exactly like everyone else. What is the problem? The problem, I think, is that for many reasons, creating stigma against LGBT persons seems to be a fruitful political discourse. And it is a fruitful political platform in many countries. I have lost track the number of local, regional, and national campaigns that are fought over the single issue of gay marriage. I have lost track of the enormity of debate around absolutely meaningless issues that are meaningless statistically, such as particular problems faced by the trans community. For some reason, these are issues that touch very deeply on people's perceptions and their fears and their preconceptions and stigma, and so they are used by religious and political authorities in the context of political campaigns. Poland, for example, is a country in which the last campaign was fought almost exclusively on the issue of LGBT issues. Religious discourse in very many parts of the world is exclusively oriented in relation to this, and I need not tell all of you friends at CVT that in Uganda, this is an issue that always peaks when the electoral campaigns are going on. So the work of making visible needs also to be accompanied by an awareness that politicians that use LGBT lives to try and use them for political purpose need to actually see that this is not a viable option, and that that accountability will exist in relation to that.
Thanks, Victor. Paul, we have a question for you. This question comes from Rita, and she's wondering about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Aftercare program, and hoping that you can speak about what CVT is currently doing. Are you running the program by Zoom, meeting in person, using social distancing, or is it kind of on a hiatus right now?
Sure. Thanks for that question. Maybe just starting from kind of a background, just to remember that our LGBTQ clients are survivors of torture to begin with. So our regular program addresses the effects of torture that they've gone through in order to heal, from effects like post-traumatic stress, functionality, depression, and all the other comorbid struggles that they go through because they're torture survivors. But a second level to this, unlike torture survivors, a lot of their torture came from the hands of family members. And you can see that already that's a second level of just how deep the effect is. But once we do the torture treatment, and I won't go too much into this, the fact that once we kind of support the healing of the survival brain when people have all the post-traumatic stress, then for LGBTQ clients, then, now that's when the reflective brain starts to kick in, and then the shame, the guilt. So, and this is why we feel the aftercare program can be very helpful at this second level after providing them the first service. So during COVID-19, we've continued to do this work. But actually, there's even a third level of challenge because of the discrimination that exists. To give you just an example, a lot of our LGBTQ clients, usually they are often thrown out of the humble, maybe accommodations that they get. And during COVID, many of them thrown out. There were some that found refuge at a church. And then immediately the government of Kenya said, no, because of social distancing, you cannot, the church cannot keep people in that space. So they can't have this refuge that they could have, but then they can't have their own accommodation. So those levels, and this is really pitting them at odds with some of the international agencies that also tend to support them. So for example, in Nairobi, unfortunately, just recently, we had one of our clients who was still a current client, but was trying to get service from one of the international NGOs and ended up committing suicide at the gate of that international NGO. It was a very unfortunate event. So we had to do what we call a lot of postvention work, a lot of support for his colleagues. But then this gave another level of this, is that the staff for this international NGO really was struggling, and we had to then go into staff care for this work. So it's really added our work maybe 3-4-fold for our LGBTQ community, plus then staff supporting even staff that do support them in this very stressful time. So maybe that's a long way to say it, Laura, but I wanted to mention the background.
Thanks, Paul. It is definitely immensely more complicated than I think I had appreciated. So, Victor, I'm going to give the last question to you before we wrap up. And this question is coming from Brady, and he is saying that, I realize that we still have a long way to go until LGBTQ people can live lives free from prejudice and fear. But I'm hoping that you can share with us an example of where you've seen an impactful success for forwarding the rights of the LGBT community.
Well, I've heard it said that there are two issues within our lifetime. I'm going to age myself, that demonstrate that social change is possible within a generation. One of them is the fight against tobacco, and the other one is LGBT rights. When you think about the fact that when I was born in Costa Rica in 1969, my existence as a gay man was criminal, sinful, and considered an illness. And that 2 months ago, equal marriage came into force in the country, you realize that actually the process of social inclusion and acceptance can happen, and it can take place within what in historical terms is a relatively short period of time. In the United States, you have exactly the same type of change from not only processes of criminalization, but from what was known as the Lavender Purge in the 40s and 50s to a structure of significant acceptance nowadays. And I can give you a significant amount of context where the case is that social change has happened, where people are living free and equal lives, where their families are appreciated as part of the social fabric, where it's understood that they need to be protected, and so on and so forth. So I think that those are very clear examples of the fact that this movement is going forward in a very decided way. What worries me, of course, are the steps back that sometimes are the result of populist discourse, and sometimes progress actually motivates backlash. We are seeing all throughout the hemisphere, and certainly throughout the world, the surge on particular narratives against equality and freedom for LGBT persons. Uganda is an example where there was the idea of reintroducing the death penalty. We all know that this was an idea that was exported from a particular church in the United States that financed the whole project of drafting the legislation. So we need to be very vigilant to those forms of backlash. And I think that there is a responsibility to create accountability in relation to those processes, so as to ensure that any of the persons that is working to actually reintroduce violence and discrimination, and what is certainly is torture, will be held accountable in whatever forum that is the case. So I think that the examples are many, but they need to be always qualified with the fact that progress is and can be frail, and there is a duty, I think, and a significant moral duty on all of us who believe in equality to remain vigilant until the work is completed. Hopefully soon enough.
Hopefully. Well, Victor, thank you for reminding us that social change is possible. And please allow me to thank you for the remarkable work you are doing and for taking the time to speak with us tonight. Paul, Jeff, Kamoy, Karen, and Stephen, thank you for sharing your passion and commitment to this work. And thanks again to our host committee for being such wonderful ambassadors for CVT. To everyone who joined our call tonight, thank you for being here. Survivors of torture get their lives back because of you. With your help, we will confront the widespread persecution of LGBTQ individuals. With your help, we will ensure that healing continues for this community. Good night, everyone. Be well.